So we've got here today what I think is maybe one of the most important topics that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about anti-racism curriculum in schools, why, what, and how. And as Reverend Stan McKay reminded us this morning, the children really are going to be what get us through a lot of the difficult times that we're facing right now. And they're the future leaders for where we're going to go. We need a cultural shift. We need to change the direction we're going, and it's going to be kids that take us there. I saw today there were over 1 million children fighting for their future today, including kids outside the Manitoba legislature as part of Greta Thunberg and the 1 million people fighting, striking for climate justice. And so applause to those folks. And what that tells me is that kids, young people, they're ready to lead, but they need to be given the tools to do that. And so having strong anti-racism curriculum available for young people will be critical for us to turn the page on the hate that we've seen demonstrated around the world and that so many of us actually experience here in Winnipeg. So we have a bit of pitch hitting today. William Barr was called away, and so he's not going to be able to make it. But we have two great speakers here today. Dr. Lori Wilkinson, you've all met already, and she's been a longtime member of ESA. And I won't give a full bio of her, but I will remark that she once drove me home when it was minus 35 or something like that. And so she deserves some credit just on that score alone, I think. And we also have Suenita Maharaj Sandu. And Suenita is an artist, a writer, and she's a human resource professional with over 20 years experience. She works in the School Division 1 in Winnipeg to enhance the anti-racism education there, and she served on the diversity committee of the RCMP locally and nationally. And I'd also invite you all to check out her book on mindfulness that is a national bestseller. So round of applause for both speakers. And which of you is speaking first? Suenita, I'll pass the mic to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Salam alaikum. Well, given the events of today and the tragedy, it seems that fitting, in part, we're here together. At the same time, it's with a heavy heart. So rather than my prepared introduction, what I think I'd like to do is start with what I intended to conclude with, which is a poem that I think reflects how many of us feel today, or how many of us here feel today. And it's a poem by a student, Grace Jeffries, a former student at Cole Harbour District High School. And she speaks about racism. The fear washes through my veins, contaminating the deep red blood. It travels through my body, further, deeper. The rage heats my skin. Igniting a blazing fire, it burns my brown skin. Heating, hurting. The sadness flows through me, touching my heart in the most sensitive places. It brings tears to my eyes as the wall of racism slams against my face. So this particular session is the why, how, the what, why, and how of anti-racist education. Before I move into the why, what, and how, I'll give you a little flavor of my own experiences. As a 7-year-old in 1968, moving from Trinidad, West Indies to Canada, Voyageur School, St. James, Crestview area. William was going to give you a sense of what newcomers are experiencing today. Unfortunately, he's not able to do that, so this might give you a little flavor of 1968. So when I moved here within the first month, I was put into a slow learners class, and my parents were told I had a learning disability, which clearly I do not. That was the first month or two. I used to carry scissors around in my pocket during elementary years because that's how afraid I was of my schoolmates. I was bullied and picked on because of the color of my skin. I was called Jungle Bunny. While I would ride my bike to school, I'd have pebbles thrown at me. So those were some of the experiences that led to this little 7-year-old, 8-year-old, and 9-year-old as I grew up carrying scissors in her pocket to protect herself. Spray paint, my dad would have to, every weekend, we'd have Packy Go Home spray painted in black on our garage, on the side of our garage, and every weekend he'd be painting over it, and of course it would happen again, but that was not as hard a job as cleaning off the eggs that were thrown at our windows regularly. And it wasn't even Halloween. And what I remember about the curriculum, the one thing that stands clearly in my mind is I remember going through our history textbook and the teacher referring to our Indigenous brothers and sisters as heathens, reflecting on they weren't Christians. And I thought to myself, well, I'm not Christian, so does that make me a heathen? And those were the sorts of things that I grew up with, that I was introduced to as a young child in Canadian society. So as evident even in today's tragedy is that our schools are in fact a microcosm of society at large. And so with that, let me start with what is anti-racist education? So there are over 50 definitions of anti-racist education you'll find in the literature. And oftentimes you'll see anti-racist education simultaneously being used with multicultural education. So it's a bit of a mix-up. There is some overlap between the two. I would say multicultural education aims to encourage differences and encourage diversity within the classroom, and essentially to prepare students to work in a diverse environment once they get out of the public school system. Whereas anti-racist education is much different. It's about equipping students, parents, and teachers with the tools needed to combat racism and discrimination, and this is a big and, to find ways to create a level playing field for all students versus the imbalance that presently exists. So what imbalance are we talking about? I guess in summary we could say that it's pretty evident that mainstream students have advantage over other groups, and this very advantage leads to disadvantage to students who are not of that mainstream community. And that includes the systems in place, the policies, the practices, the ways of teaching, the methodology, right starting from faculties of education, as we were speaking of earlier. Whereas anti-racist education has to do with how the schools are run in terms of things like who gets involved in the decision making, which parents' voices are heard and which are ignored. It has to do with who gets hired and which students see role models that they can see themselves in, people who look like them, sound like them, and which students do not have these same role models who are in authority positions. So having said all that, I would say the main difference between multicultural education and anti-racist education is that multicultural education is more proactive. It encourages diversity in the learning environment, and it encourages different worldviews to be presented, whereas anti-racist education is more reactive. It assumes that racism exists and is present in the school system, okay? And it aims to challenge and change those systems and prevent disadvantage to students based on systems that are in place that have systemic barriers. I think it's important here to talk about the term diversity. I need this not to see you, and I need this to see my paper. So I think it's important to talk about the term diversity, because some people prefer the term diversity, and I know a lot of organizations and in school talk about diversity education and being a diverse place. And I have to say that my experience from 25 years in the area, or over 25 now, of the area of race relations, and by the way, I am not presently with Winnipeg School Division. I was the race relations officer for Winnipeg School Division a very long time ago, and I was the employment equity coordinator for Winnipeg School Division a very long time ago. I'm retired now, but I am on the RCMP committee, so there you go. Anyway, so I think the reason the term diversity is preferred by many is because it softens the reality of racism. We can say, oh, you know, we have diversity in our school. Yes, of course you have diversity. You have different student population. You have diverse student groups. But then to take that a step further and say, well, what does your staff look like? What do the principals across the division look like? That's where you take it one step further. I think what diversity doesn't acknowledge is that students in the public school system do not have a playing field, a level playing field. That there are students from various groups that are disadvantaged, and many of those groups are our newcomers, and as proven in research, are Indigenous students. I like to say that we can have equality of opportunity, but not equality of outcome, and I think that makes the point pretty clear. We can say, well, all students have access to public schools, they have access to the same learning, they have access to the same materials, not necessarily, but we say that. They all have the same opportunity to get an education, but we don't all have the same outcomes. It's very clear from the research and the literature that while all students have the same experience and quote-unquote opportunity, the outcomes are very different. And that's where anti-racist education focuses its message, is what are the outcomes? So when we see that some groups of students have higher dropout rates, that's an outcome. When we see that some groups of students have higher suspension and discipline rates, there's an outcome. When we see that some students, like myself, are funneled into non-post-secondary education programming at higher rates than others, that's an outcome. So the research and the evidence indicates that with some groups, there are sometimes lower expectations for achievement based on race and ethnicity, and that, in fact, will create these outcomes that we are talking about. I have 20 minutes, so just in case you're wondering. I think it's worth mentioning also that students and families who are subjected to racial discrimination and intimidation in the school are often silent about what is happening. And the result of this is that racism remains hidden or ignored. And the sad part is when that happens is it becomes almost a norm, a common part of the school environment. Something as small as, you know, and we still do it now, I was called Sue instead of Suenita. When I was in school, that became my name, is sending a clear message to students that, you know, you fit into our worldview, into what is familiar to us, and that's the way it is. So you will be Sue from now on because I'm comfortable with calling you Sue. So we have to, just small, tiny little things like that are microaggressions that send clear messages, not just to the student, but to other students, the mainstream students. I just, in terms of when students do speak out, some of the poignant moments in my childhood from schooling was I remember being pushed to the playground and on the playground and being called names like Mudgerudge and Jungle Bunny and so on. And in Trinidad, of course, if that happens, you go to the authority figure, you go to the students. And when I went to my teacher, I remember clearly to this day her saying to me, well, you have to learn how to fight your own battles. I was 8 years old and being pushed on the playground. Now, I being an older and an adult right now, I wonder, gee, if I was blonde, blue-eyed, and maybe looked like a niece or a daughter or somebody that teacher was familiar with, if she would have said that. What is the, you know, where does this kind of thinking and response come from? So one of the things the research says is that newcomers come to expect that Canada has this underlayer of racism that they just have to put up with. That's the way it is. That's something that anti-racist education seeks to change, for sure. But I know, again, and I'll throw in a few of my experiences, I remember when I was growing up, that was definitely the case. I would go home and my parents would say to me, well, you know, you have to be twice as good as, you know, they didn't say mainstream friends, but I'll say mainstream counterparts to get the same thing. So you just remember that you have to be twice as good and work twice as hard. And of course I believe that. And they followed that up with, and you better not do anything wrong because, you know, they'll get away with it, but you can't. You're not white, so you better watch it. And unfortunately and sadly, those words came to be true. And those were words that I lived as a child in elementary school. So, anti-racism is about examining our systems and determining what parts we're taking for granted as just the way things are, as opposed to this is racism disguised. This is systemic discrimination based on race. I like to say anti-racism is not window dressing, and over 25 years I've seen a few things I just like to throw out to you. One is that, and I've been hired into many of these positions, it's not window dressing. Many places, whether it's a board of trustees or a school board or an employer, think that they can have a position called diversity coordinator or equity inclusion coordinator. And, you know, there, we've got something. Look, we're actually paying this person. However, what I've come to learn very quickly is when you look to really be a catalyst for change or for real change in the systems as they are, that's not what's wanted. What is wanted is the status quo, and what is wanted is a anti-race relations officer or, you know, what have you, so that it can be pointed out, we have this. It's not learning a different language or how to say, or it's not learning how to say hello in a different language. It's not, you know, having, here's the, we're gonna have cultural days and showcase all these different cultures. Those are all great, and that's part of multicultural education, but in isolation, they're meaningless and they mean nothing. And in fact, they can sometimes make things worse as bringing up people's culture to a day a year or dress and food, you know, as opposed to the reality of the values and the things cherished and the traditions. So that's not what it is. How much time do I have left? As much I don't think I'm 20 minutes yet. Okay, so that's the what, the why, very quickly. You know, we could talk about the fact that 7 of Canada's source countries for newcomers are India, China, I've got a list here, Pakistan, Iran, Syria, South Korea, the Philippines, and the Philippines and India being the 2 top source countries. We can talk about that. That's safe to talk about, and that's what I often hear about. We hear all these demographics. Or we could talk about it's a business case. You know, we need anti-racist multicultural education because our workforce is so diverse and our clients are diverse, and any of the students going out there need to be able to work with diverse clients. In order to get a job in Canadian society today, you need to have those cultural sensitivity skills, and for sure you'll see that on many ads. You'll say cultural sensitivity is a a qualification or ability to work with diverse groups. You'll see that, but that's all it is. It's a one line on a job ad. How does that translate into the workplace is another story. I often think it should be a mandatory qualification to say that teachers, principals, counselors need to be able to have as a qualification cultural sensitivity and ability and having worked with diverse groups and in a meaningful way. But I'd rather than say that, rather than talk about demographics and talk about the business case for anti-racist education, I'd rather talk about the why behind incidents like the violent clashes that broke out in BC between white and South Asian high school students that were linked to a sentencing hearing for 5 skinheads who were convicted for beating an elderly Sikh man to death. Of course, I'm not going to talk about that today, but that's part of what we need to dialogue on. Or, and with all due respect to our law enforcement people whom, 5 minutes left, thank you, to our law enforcement people here today whom I was actually many years ago on the Chief of Police Diversity Committee for the City of Winnipeg and presently with the RCMP, and I know we have many allies doing very good work. I have to say that we need to also dialogue the why behind the incident in 2016 of a 6-year-old grade 1 student in Toronto who had been placed in handcuffs by police officers who were called to the school saying the child was being violent and posed a risk to other students. The 2 police officers had handcuffed the girl, who weighed a total of 48 pounds and was unarmed, by attaching her hands and her feet together at the wrists and ankles. The response of both the school and the police when criticized was, it was for her own safety and the safety of others. Those are the dialogues we need to in part have. How does that happen? Our schools are a reflection of our society. Our schools are a microcosm of our society. So with those examples, I leave you with the what is it and the why. The how, there are many excellent resources out there. There's no point in reinventing the wheel. Anybody who wants this kind of work in their schools, I will be sending to Shahina a list of links to websites that will give you excellent programs and materials, and hopefully you will in fact use it. With that, I say thank you all for being allies. Thank you all for being here, and I will turn it over to my dear friend Lori.
Thank you very much. I was asked about half an hour ago to speak on this topic, but I'm speaking about it as a university professor making some observations about my students, the people that I work with, and in particular the educators, not only in my institution but other institutions as well, because we have, in my circle, of anti-racist researchers and activists, we talk about this a lot. But I also don't want to diminish some of the great work that's going on as well, because there is some great work. I think it just gets marginalized or pushed aside or ignored. So I'll make 3 points. One is it kind of picking up on Suenita's comments about educating the educators. When I was a university student 20 years ago, anti-racism education, multicultural diversity education, you could get that in a faculty of education, but it was not. It wasn't very popular. It wasn't there was no mandatory classes there. People weren't encouraged to focus on those issues, and it was also hived off into separate classes. And so ideally, thinking about these issues as part of every part of the curriculum, because racism filters into every part of the curriculum. And it really came clear to me when I was a new professor, when I started to hear this, and sadly I didn't hear it, I heard it way more than once. And I used to teach a class on anti-racism that education students could take to get out of a boring theory class. That's what I was told, that this theory class in education was boring, and so they wanted to come to this ethnic relations class and learn about riots and hate crimes. And I used to hear this, I'm sad to say, often from student teachers who would come up to me and they would say, well, this is all nice and interesting history, but I don't need to know any of this because I'm going to teach in a white school. And the first time I heard it, I literally was taken aback. I'm like, how can you be intending to teach our children when you have that kind of attitude? And then as I got older and more jaded, my thought process is, what is this mythical white school you speak of? I don't think that exists. And it just really solidified my opinions and thoughts around making this a central part of our curriculum, which I'll get back to when I talk about what we do in the university. Educators, my colleagues in education, they often talk about how do we get more students into education who look like our community, because teaching still is a largely white person's occupation. And so thinking about what is it that prevents people who come from all religions and all backgrounds, what prevents them from being interested in coming to an education faculty and learning to become a teacher? And I think part of it has to do with having a welcoming environment that validates their experiences, but also requires some serious structural change, which I'll talk about at the university as my last point. So we'll table the full point till I get to the end. And then as Suenita alluded to, we don't have to invent the wheel, but I think we need to make the materials more accessible to not only just teachers, but to everyone. So, folks like me are trying to work towards making material more accessible so that the teachers who are interested in making this kind of change can find what they need to make this kind of change. The second point I want to make is about educating our young people. I've heard many, many people who I admire, and even some world leaders talk about how they feel about, when they think about hope, they think about our young people. And I think about myself as a professor that, in the last 5 years, I haven't had to ask my students questions like, do you know what a residential school is? So when I naively first moved to Winnipeg, I actually thought, you know what, the students here are going to know way more about Indigenous issues than I ever did because, they grew up in Manitoba. And so my first ethnic relations class, I just kind of slid into a discussion about residential schools, and somebody puts up their hands and says, well, what's a residential school? And so I put it out to the class, because thinking, well, there's got to be people in the classroom that know what a residential school was. This was in 2001, by the way. But you know what? Now, this year, when I ask the question, because I don't want to presume anymore. When I ask the question, quite rightly, the only people in the room who don't know about a residential school are our international students. And so I do see that change is happening, but we still need to do a bit more in terms of educating our young people. We need to give them the tools necessary to react when they see racism, and to not be afraid and to speak out, and to give the tools necessary to the teachers too, because many of them don't have that toolkit either. But also to know a lot more about our history. The older I get, the more passionate I get about history, because this summer when Viola Desmond was put on the $10 bill, people like me had to explain to a lot of people who she even was. And this should be a part of our curriculum. Like, Canadian students should know about her contribution. I'm glad she's on the $10 bill, and she was the right person to be selected. Hands down. But it's sad that we don't have her story as part of our curriculum. And I think that gets us to preparing all people to have a good quality education. And as a sociologist, I know not everybody has access to a good quality education. That even in Canada, where education up until grade 12 is absolutely free, it's not the same quality. We don't have the same access across the country. And so a lot of the good knowledge and the good information remains hidden or accessible only to some people. It shouldn't be that you wander into my ethnic relations class to learn about this at the university. And even at the university, how many people wander into an ethnic relations class or a history class? This stuff should not be hidden in a university. It should be shared widely so that we can educate our citizenry to respond to and understand the issues of our day. And also so that the content is reflective of the people in our society. I talked to my student Annette quite a bit, and she told me about when she lived in Uganda learning about Saskatchewan. It totally blew my mind. Like, how do you learn about Saskatchewan in Uganda? Because when I grew up in Saskatchewan, I learned nothing about Africa. Now, I am 25 years older than Annette, but I'm pretty certain that there's not that kind of education going on today, that the content still doesn't reflect the people who are in the room. So the third point I want to make is about challenging the structures that encourage, because this has been going on for generations. This is how knowledge has been transmitted and hidden from certain groups of people, that only privileged people can get knowledge. And so challenging the structures that perpetuate and maintain and normalize racism and the way that we're operating today, it's tough work. That changing the structure, but then again, I guess if it was easy work, we would have changed the structures a long time ago. I even see resistance at my own university, at the University of Manitoba. There is a big resistance to change. So when we talk about indigenizing the university, I notice that many of my colleagues in upper administration have a much different vision of indigenization than some of us who work in this field. So some people think, well, indigenization just means we'll bring more Indigenous students into the university. That's great. That's a noble goal, but that's not indigenizing the academy. Maybe we can just add or change our lectures, make it mandatory that every class touches on or includes some aspect of indigenization in their lectures. Well, you can't add indigenization to your lecture. Like, that's just an add-on, right? Like, we're just forcing this on, and for many of my colleagues, some of them don't know how they would indigenize their classes, but some of them would fight against indigenizing their classes. And I know this, I am married to a natural scientist who also teaches at the university, and he doesn't think it applies to him or what he does. Well, that's wrong. He does think it applies to him, but many of his colleagues are very resistant to that. Like, why do I need to do this? And so you have a group of people who are against even that small action, which is also not indigenizing. The University of Winnipeg has already passed this. The University of Manitoba is about to pass this as well, that every graduate has to take a course, an I course, an indigenization course. Again, forcing people into a class that they don't want to take, that has no connection with the curriculum that they're learning elsewhere. That class is going to fail, right? We have, if you're an engineer and the indigenization it only occurs in the one course that you're forced to take, but has no connection with being an engineer or anything else that you're taught in any of the other classes, this is not going to have the intended consequence, that it becomes one of those extra classes that you're forced to take that's separate from what I'm really going to do. And that kind of goes back to what had been happening in many faculties of education, that it's separate from and above and different from what I'm really going to be doing. But I see these as the initiatives that many of my upper administration colleagues are excited about. And these are like these are like the easy things. To them, it's very hard, but it's the easy things, and I think these are the things that are not what we need. What we need to do is to change the structure. And changing the structure of my university and other universities, how do we go about doing that? Because the structure itself is racist. The structure itself doesn't give voice to people who have been marginalized. It pushes them through. And when I think about many of my international students who graduate, they're brilliant, smart, wonderful people, and we want them to stay in Canada, and they take 6 to 9 months longer to get a job than my white students do. And so how does the structure play into those differential outcomes that you were just speaking about? And I don't have the answers to this, but I do know, pressing my administration about simple things like these "it's okay to be white" posters. You know, I had pressed my president several times, and he listens, and we make suggestions about responding, and then we don't do anything. And doing nothing is the worst thing that we can do. And that's what I see in a lot of places when there's a reluctance to change, that it's just easier not to do anything. We're gonna not do anything because we're so afraid to make a mistake, that it's just easier to do nothing, and doing nothing just validates the marginalization that people feel. So that's my pathetic attempt at trying to share with you my thoughts on that situation. There's probably some time for questions and answer, or do we have to move forward?
I think we've got a few minutes, yeah. I'll take one of these. Are there any questions?
Turn on your microphone.
Test.
You can hear me now. Excellent. Are there any questions? Yes.
Microphone, please.
For sure.
Okay, so my name is Hannah, and I am in the field of the religious organization, which is church, and I really resonate my experience, and I can put the kind of pattern and common pattern or something like that to what both of you said. But when we talk about the structural change, I have been really wondering because people talk about the structural change, and when people who are in the position of changing the structure are not changed, how the structure can be changed has been my question. Like, structure is actually people. So even if the structure is changed, if people who change the structure don't change or aren't changed, then what does that mean? So, because I have 12 years old and 8 years old children, and they go to their schools, and you know, it's just ground level, just regular schools. And then I'm a newcomer, and I see that most school teachers and the principals are white people, right? And then I can imagine that those who are in the high rank, who can actually be the more effective agents of change, probably the white people still. And then some of them are good allies and important allies, and they are now really trying hard to be the agents of the changes. But even they are the people, and then they are the structure, and you know, all kinds of things. Even though the structure, we talk about structure change, when people don't change, what does that mean? That's my question.
Well, a couple of things. I think what you might be referring to is a systems review. And in a systems review, what we do is you take a look at all your policies, all your practices, all your procedures, in terms of the school testing, who's teaching, equity, employment equity, who are the decision makers, who are on the committees, who are on your on your parent councils, and if there's not diverse representation of your student population, how do you get that representation? How do you recruit? Why Why aren't they there? You have to go through all the policies, all the practices, all the procedures, your blueprint for living in your school, right from your board of trustees down to the playground and who's supervising in the playground. And you need to look at it and say, where is it in there? And look for systems that discriminate or have adverse impact to students or teachers, in fact, who are not of the majority. So look at the power relationships. So I'd say it starts with a needs assessment that's inclusive of your diverse communities, quote unquote diverse communities, and make sure that you start looking at all your levels of decision making, because you identified the big problem there is the decision makers are typically mainstream Caucasian community, which means that that's the worldview they're bringing, and through no fault, it's not a fault, it's how do you take a look at your committees, your decision makers, and making sure that there's some representation there of your student population.
I agree too. I'd like to add, these changes, the structural changes, are going to take a long time. The way that school's been structured here has been structured this way, for many decades, and you even look at the way university's structured, it's not a lot different from how it was structured, centuries ago. But I had the chance to read the transcript of Barack Obama's visit here in Winnipeg, and one thing that he said that really struck me is that politicians actually don't make decisions, or they don't lead. They lead after the citizens. And so one of the group things that we could consider as a community is leading the charge to require our structures to change, because that's about the only way a politician's going to listen. And if the politicians start listening, they start channeling their funding into ways that they want, ways and issues that they want changed or they want to be supported. And it's slow, it moves like a turtle. But I think it's a start that we work together as a group to require change.
Thank you. I'd be interested in your reaction to two things. One is you both talked in one way or another about a criterion of equality of outcome. One that, Lori, might mean that your racialized graduates are just as likely to get a job as non-racialized graduates. So I'm interested in your thinking about whether it makes good strategic sense to push that criterion, that all educational institutions should be judged on the basis of whether there is equality of outcome based on race, gender, ethnicity. Secondly, I'd just like to commend both of you. And Lori just said it, these institutions are not how they are by accident. At our own university, I think the first reaction of our senior administration when issues like this are raised is to hire a communications consultant and have our president put out one of his statements. So that administration needs to be experiencing pressure from below, from faculty members, but it needs to be experiencing pressure from outside also, and it has to know that no cadre of communication consultants will be enough. Thanks. Oh, sorry, Josh.
Just to answer, well, first, thank you. And secondly, just to answer your question, yes, absolutely. I think we need to use metrics to start to make that, evaluate if outcomes are equal or where are we falling short. So absolutely, it would be great if we could implement something where in a mandatory way, schools had to identify, who is dropping out, who is being suspended, who are your teachers, and using very specific metrics to evaluate what's happening, what are your outcomes, because it's fine to say, as I said before, we have a diversity coordinator, we have an equity coordinator, but yeah, that's nice for that person, but, or is it just a token position that when that person starts to do something, people don't want it, they want the status quo.
I think I'll answer your two questions in one answer, which I don't think I've ever done. Structural change in one institution, if it starts in education, is going to necessitate change in other institutions, right? So we can work hard at the university to equalize things, but there's only so much I can do to make sure that my students get hired at equal rates, which means we have to change the way we hire people and change the way we organize our disciplines. And that's going to change the work world. And then you think about changing the work world, we're probably going to have to change the healthcare world. So thinking about the last panel before lunchtime, changing the way healthcare is delivered so that it is delivered in an equitable way. And I think maybe I see it as a domino. Do I see it starting in education? Quite possibly, because there's some bright lights in that world that maybe can institute change. And that maybe that change does have a domino effect on the rest of society. I don't know, but I think that's a start.
If I may, I have a question about how do we deal with, I think in both your presentations you presented it as a bit of forward progress, that we're making advances in some of these areas. But at the same time, I see governments across Canada wanting to make cutbacks. And very often, it's things like diversity education and multiculturalism that end up on the on the chopping block when we see cutbacks. So how do we fight back against some of those directions as well that we see in our education system?
Well, it's ironic you should ask that because I'm retired now. My last position was the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Coordinator for Red River College. I hear they're hiring somebody again. Maybe they realized they couldn't do without us. Also was cut was the Human Rights Complaint Officer for the college. That was cut, and also the Department of Diversity and Inclusion was disbanded and integrated into student services. So yes, I think it comes from the community and people speaking out. I think if people did speak out, including not just the people with the vested interest, perceived vested interest in those positions, but the entirety of the community, whether it's the school or the college or the university, we have to gather allies and we have to prepare ourselves for these things. We for example, have CAPTI, the Canadian Association for the Prevention of Discrimination and Harassment in Higher Education, of which I was on the executive of previous to, or while I was at the college. They, for example, have a forum where they do that, they do speak out. I suggest that other groups do the same. And I think that makes, as a group, that forces governments to pay attention.
I think we need to monitor our political parties and to watch, right? And in Manitoba, they've cut back on education spending. In Ontario, they've rolled back the sex ed curriculum to the dark ages. And I think we need to call out politicians who do this and political parties that support this, but we need to do this in a way that empowers people. So I think about the work that Immigration Partnerships Winnipeg has been doing to their Get Out the Vote campaign. Many of the people who they brought to their event in October can't vote now but they can vote in the future. And I've done some work with IPW, and we've been trying really hard with our city councilors just to make immigration a talking point. I'm shocked. In a city where 24% of the population is an immigrant or a former immigrant, in a city where 16% of the population has Indigenous background, that our city councilors do not have time for us. And again, like calling out politicians who don't have time for us, who don't, you know, like, for me, it's like, can you not even accept the demographic argument that, you know, 40% of potential voters, you're totally isolating them and marginalizing them? Like, we need to take note of that, and we need to vote for people who support diversity and support our communities, whether it's through healthcare investments, social support investments. Those are the people we need to support and champion.
Well, thanks so much for those comments, and thank you both for your excellent remarks. Applause for Suenita and Laurie. And I think that's wrapping up this session, and I'll pass it to Krishna to wrap up.
Okay, once again, thank you. And we're actually going to close with some thoughts from Shahina, which is appropriate, I think. I personally wanted to thank you all for your attendance throughout the last 2 days, and especially today, which was hard, but important. And I'm glad that we were vigilant and remained here and continued on. And I think we learned quite a bit. And I'm proud to say that we actually doubled our efforts this year, in spite of all of these obstacles. 16 sessions is a pretty difficult thing, alongside at least 8 conversation cafes. So let's give ourselves a round of applause. And just 2 more quick thank yous. I wanted to thank Paul Graham, who's been standing essentially for 16 hours over the last 2 days filming the entirety of this, which he will upload to his YouTube channel, and of course we will put it on ISA's website. I think and of course ISA has shouldn't I know that? ISA has a YouTube page, and I think it's important that we proliferate and share what we learned here these 2 days on social media. So thank you, Paul. And Irene, who is not in this room, is she? Oh, there you are, sorry. Irene, who is unequivocally like the vertebrae at the spine of ISA, as far as, you are the entire skeleton, Auntie. But she, like, honestly, thank you for everything that you did this in pulling this together. Like, all of these speakers, 16 sessions, that's a logistical nightmare for any organizer. So thank you for everything that you did, and thank you, Shahina, too. I mean, Auntie, oh my God. I'm so tired, Auntie. Did you see how she has fight in her still? So can we give Irene a round of applause, too? And with that, I'd like to pass the microphone to Auntie Shahina.
I'll just close with a prayer, and I'll say it in Arabic. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal asr innal insana lafi khusr illa allazina amanu wa amilu salihati wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr. Our tradition is that when a gathering disperses, we finish with this verse, which our scholars have said, if we understood this verse, it would be enough guidance for humanity. So it says in English, by time, God swears that surely human beings are at loss, except those who believe, do good deeds, and counsel each other to truth, and counsel each other to perseverance. So I leave with this prayer, and God bless you, and safe journey home. Thank you.
Thank you.